Tony. Come on, it's Sunday Night Live. We need a little pep in our step. Right? We need a little pep in our step. All right. Well, because I didn't get more amens, turn to 574. Number 574. We're just going to use the chorus, and then we're going to have a spiritual conversation. You might remember this from when you were young. But it's got a lot of energy, and it's exciting, and Chuck's been picking on me, so it gives me an opportunity to pick on him back. You'll know this chorus. Let's sing it together, and then I'll show you how the conversation's going to go. Oh, how I love Jesus. Oh, how I love Jesus. Oh, how I love Jesus. Because He first loved me. Oh, church, do you love Jesus? Oh, yes, I love Jesus. Are you sure you love Jesus? Yes, I'm sure I love Jesus. Tell us why you love Jesus. This is why I love Jesus. Because He first loved me. Oh, how I love Jesus. Oh, how I love Jesus. Oh, how I love Jesus, because He first loved me. Daniel Smith. Oh, Daniel, do you love Jesus? Oh, yes, I love Jesus. Are you sure you love Jesus? Sure I love Jesus. Tell us why you love Jesus. Because He first loved me. Oh, how I love Jesus. Oh, how I love Jesus. Oh, how I love Jesus. Because He first loved me. Oh, Chuck, do you love Jesus?
Deborah?
Chuck!
Yes, I love Jesus.
Are you sure you love Jesus?
Yes, I'm sure I love Jesus.
Tell us why you love Jesus.
This is why I love Jesus.
Because He first loved me. Oh, how I love Jesus. Oh, how I love Jesus. Oh, how I love Jesus. Because He first loved me. Picking on her because I love her. Oh, Dawn, do you love Jesus? Yes, you do. Are you sure you love Jesus? Tell us why you love Jesus. Because He first loved me. Last time. Oh, how I love Jesus. Oh, how I love Jesus. Oh, how I love Jesus. Because He first loved me. What a reason to be here. I got more amens that time. Tony had caught on. Joshua chapter 11. We took a break, of course, because of our month of families, but we've been in Joshua for pretty much this whole year, and we're starting to wind down. Now, if you look at the book, you say, yeah, but there's a lot more chapters, preacher. That's true. There's a lot more chapters, but they're going to kind of deal with the details of distributing the land. So we'll have fewer lessons from here on out, and they'll encompass a broader breadth of more passages. So we're really winding down because tonight represents the final campaign. It represents the end of the war. Because you know from the text that Chuck read for us a few moments ago, it says, and there was peace in the land. There was no more war in the land. Now there's going to be remnants and certainly the scattered leftovers of these pagan nations that are going to cause them a lot of trouble for years and years and years to come. But as far as the conquest goes, chapter 11 marks the end of this great war and this great conquest of the promised land. But in chapter 11, we read the events that led to the final close. And we see in verse 4, they went out, they and all their armies with them, as many people as the sand that was on the seashore in the multitude, with very many horses and chariots. Now we'll see that as this chapter starts out, we see that a northern king by the name of Jabin of Hazor has assembled a mighty fighting force. They've heard about the Israelites. The Israelites had pretty much conquered everything in the southern portion of the Promised Land. So now, this king of Hazor, Jabin, in the northern section of the Promised Land, he realizes he and his fellow cities are next on their list. So, in fear of not wanting to be conquered, the Israelites have destroyed everyone who stood in their path. He gathers up this coalition. Now, they've faced coalitions before, but this one's not quite like what they've seen. When I was reading through some history, I found that this city of Hazor was a mighty great city. Now, we don't recognize that really in the text because it's not given as much attention as Jericho, but many times the size of Jericho. In fact, they estimate it encompassed about 200 acres, which for an ancient city, that's a lot of ground to have a wall all the way around it. This is a massive metropolis with a great, powerful army. And so he combines with several other of these northern city-states, and they create an army like Israel's not faced before. It is massive. The scriptures talk about a great many fighting men and cavalry and horses and chariots. And they gather them together and they camp at a place called Merom, the waters of Merom, which is northwest of what we would know as the Sea of Galilee. And they gather there in force just to kind of demonstrate how large this force is, demonstrate their might. But God encourages Joshua that Israel will indeed, just like every other time when they trusted him, Israel will indeed have the victory. Then it says in chapter 11, verses 8 and 9, "And the Lord delivered them into the hand of Israel, who defeated them and chased them to Greater Sidon, and to the brook of Misrephoth, and to the valley of Mizpah, eastward. And they attacked them until they left none of them remaining. And Joshua did as the Lord had told him. He hamstrung their horses, and he burned their chariots with fire." Israel takes the initiative, it says in the text. And rather than waiting to be attacked by this massive force, Joshua takes his people and they pounce upon this opportunity. They attack them, and it's a rout. The enemies all scatter, and they chase them down, and they have an utter victory. Verse 14 of the text. "And all the spoils of the city and the livestock the children of Israel took as a booty for themselves. But they struck every man with the edge of the sword until they had destroyed them, and they left none breathing." So Joshua kills the kings of each city, and he wipes out the people, and Israel plunders the great wealth of all of these northern cities. And then finally, verses 21 through 22. "And at that time Joshua came and cut off the Anakim from the mountains of Hebron, and from Debir, and from Anab, and from the mountains of Judah, and from all the mountains of Israel. Joshua utterly destroyed them with their cities, and none of the Anakim were left in the land of the children of Israel, but they remained only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod." So finally, God helps them to destroy their ancient enemy, the Anakites, of which only a few will survive in the cities of the Philistines. That's the Philistine cities of Gath and of Gaza and of Ashdod. So that's kind of how the chapter plays out, the historical events that take place here. But there is so much richness in this passage. It's so applicable, and it teaches us some powerful lessons that can mean as much to us today as it meant to them all those thousands of years ago. The text marks the end of the conquest. This is their final victory. There will be stragglers remaining in the land, and they will be a problem for years to come. But as of the end of chapter 11, Israel is now master of their promised land. God's promise has been utterly fulfilled that had been made all those hundreds and hundreds of years before. But we learn a great many things from this final battle. The first of which is that a desperate enemy is going to use desperate tactics. You see, this northern king, Jabin, he had heard of the destruction that followed everyone who stood against Israel, the destruction in their wake. And so he threw a Hail Mary. Everybody know what a Hail Mary is? Raise your hand if you don't know what a Hail Mary is. Okay, you were not raised in the South. Okay, a Hail Mary is a football term, okay? And what it means is that when all else fails, when there's no other hope for victory, there's a long shot play called a Hail Mary. And that's where you spread out all your receivers and you tell them to go long, and the quarterback fades back, holds the ball as long as he can until the defenders he can smell their breath, and then he chucks it as far as possible and hopes and prays that one of those receivers can jump up and catch the ball. It's a desperation move. And I'll tell you, this is the final desperation move of the enemies of God's people. We see that it is because of the way that they stand against Israel. They don't try to plan an attack. They don't try to sneak up on them. What do? They just gather all this army and they camp in a very, very visible location. Not a tactically or strategic place for them to be. But they camp there, and we see that this is intended for the same purpose that desperate enemies will often gather and rally their forces in a Hail Mary. That's because what they're trying to do is do what the enemies of God's people have always done, and what the enemy of God's people today continues to do over and over, and that is he seeks to intimidate God's people and cause them to fear, because that king had already seen Israel beat every great foe that on paper or by the wisdom of man should have wiped out these slaves and sheep herders. But everyone who had stood before him, they had trampled them into the dust. He knew it. So he gathers as large a force as he can for intimidation and fear in this very visible spot. Maybe this will make Israel doubt. Maybe it'll make them hesitant. Josephus, in talking about this event, estimated that this force was 300,000 infantry, 10,000 cavalry, and 20,000 chariots. There is no way that Israel could have matched that force. They didn't have the weaponry. They didn't have the men. They didn't have the training. They had some experience now, but they weren't hardened battle warriors like the Hittites and the Philistines. But yet they'd beaten everybody, and this king knows it. But they look upon an enemy trying this desperate tactic. And how often do we see that? Have you ever started to gain the victory in your own personal life over maybe sins that you've struggled with a long time, and you start to gain the victory, and things start to improve, or maybe over struggles and you've held on in faith and you start to gain the victory, but then what always happens? The enemy strikes back. But generally it's not a strike that has any teeth to it. Generally the enemy strikes back at us through fear and intimidation. Doesn't he? Well, yeah, it's going well now, but, I've fallen so many times before. Is it really going to last? You know what that is? Fear and intimidation. Oh, yeah, the cancer's doing better and I'm in remission, but, I've looked at the statistics and what's really, can I really dive back into my life and my faith? Because, what's probably going to happen tomorrow? Fear and intimidation. Do you realize how common it is for our enemy to use this same tactic? To bluster, to brag, to try to make us afraid so that we will be lulled into inaction. You see, the only way that this king was going to beat Israel is for Israel just not to attack him. And in truth, our enemy has fought the Lord and His church for 2,000 years. And every time he hit the church head on, you just read the history of the first 400 years of the Lord's church, how our brave men and women of the army of God never lifted a sword. And they beat the devil at his own war. They beat him back to, by the end of that 4th century, Christianity had become so widespread that even the Emperor Constantine chose to believe in God. When those same emperors had been persecuting and murdering and throwing God's people into the arena to face the lions and to face the gladiators, but yet when Satan took the fight directly to the people of God, what happened? God's people won. It was true for Israel, and it's true for spiritual Israel. So you know what the enemy would rather do? He'd rather make his forces look so big that he causes us to tremble in fear. So we just won't do anything. And folks, this is an important message. This is happening in the United States of America with the churches of our Lord Jesus Christ. There are thousands of our brethren who are trembling in fear. Oh, look at the way society is changing. Oh, look at the way people's morals are deteriorating. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? What are we going to do? And you know what many congregations are doing about it? Nothing. Because they're seeing the chariots and they're seeing the soldiers and they're seeing the cavalry. And they're just trembling in fear. No. We need to remember that God's people, if they'll just be willing to fight, are always victorious. You see, we notice that, and this is what I found intriguing in the text, the Gibeonites had asked for peace and they got it. Remember that? We preached about that. Now, it wasn't exactly what God's plan was, but that God and His people still honored their word. So it was obvious to these northern kings that it was possible to have peace with Israel. Why didn't they ask for it? Why didn't they ask for it? Let me be very clear. Satan is never going to make peace with the church. Satan is never going to make peace with you. He's going to hate you even when you whoop him. He's going to want to fight you even when it's hopeless. That's the nature of the enemy of God's people. So rather than surrender, rather than negotiate a peace, in their pride, they were not going to bow down and negotiate with a bunch of sheep herders and slaves. They weren't going to do it. So they come up with this Hail Mary. And it ends up in their destruction. 1 Peter 5, 8 through 11. Our enemy is exactly the same. Be alert and of sober mind. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, looking for whom he may devour. But resist him. Stand firm in the faith, because you know that the family of believers throughout the world is undergoing the same kind of suffering. A roaring lion. I never understood that till I went to Ethiopia the first time to do short-term missions. And an Ethiopian explained that to me. He said, you know, a roaring lion is a wounded lion. He said when a lion is sneaking up on their prey, they do not roar. Well, that kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. They do what my dog does when she's sneaking up on something. You know, that thing, right? And it kind of messes up the whole process if you roar. But I don't know much about lions, but I have seen documentaries about grizzly bears. When we lived in Idaho, there was a whole section in the hunting manual they put out every year on how to tell the difference between a black bear and a grizzly bear, because Yellowstone National Park laps over into the state of Idaho, and so there's no fences, so then grizzly bears just back and forth. And there have been times when hunters were hunting for black bear and they mistakenly shot the wrong kind. That's bad. Because you use a different kind of rifle to shoot a grizzly bear than you do a black bear. And so what happens when a grizzly bear is wounded? You know what it does? It charges and it roars. That ear-shattering roar. Because it's in agony and it's in pain and it has only one thought. And what's that? To destroy you. Really? To destroy everything. That's what they do. Same with the lion. Our enemy, the devil, is a roaring lion. He is lost and he knows it. But he is a roaring, vindictive, hateful lion seeking whom he may devour. And so no matter how victorious you may become, no matter how many sins you may overcome in your life, no matter how spiritual you may rise to, don't ever think you're beyond his hatred and his temptation and his attacks. He will always attack you. Always. We look also in the text and we see in verse 7, it says, Then Joshua and the people of war with him came again against them suddenly by the waters of Merom, and they attacked them. We see also that not only do we have a desperate enemy with desperate tactics, God's people must press the attack. God's people must press the attack. Joshua didn't wallow in his fear and endlessly contemplate his options. Sometimes the best course of action is just to do something. And not just constantly mull over what's the best thing to do. I'm preaching again to the church that I've loved these last 25 years. But I've seen this over and over too. Well, we're not growing. What kind of evangelism program should we do? Well, should we do buses? Well, that didn't work before. Should we do bring, teach, keep? Well, have you seen the guy who runs that thing? I don't know if we need to do that. Should we do this? Should we do that? And you know what I've seen? And I've seen it a lot. Church is talking about, we know we need to do something, but what do we need to do? And just do something. And if that doesn't work, do something else. You know? Press the attack. What God doesn't need are soldiers who sit back in their fear and constantly just reevaluate their options. Because do you know what's happening while we're reevaluating? The enemy's still fighting. We have to press the attack. They pressed on. Believers must be proactive. The church should be proactive in our fight against the devil in this world. And notice what it says in verse 9. That Joshua did to them as the Lord told him, and he hamstrung their horses, and he burned their chariots with fire. God had told them, you can take the loot from those cities that you conquer, but their horses and their chariots, their means of waging war, I want you to hamstring the horses. We love horses, so that's a terrible thing to think about. But hamstring the horses and burn those chariots. Burn those chariots. Now, there's probably a lot of application we could make from that. But what I think it says to me is, why didn't he want them to have those horses? Why didn't he want them to have those chariots? Because Joshua and God's people don't fight like the enemy does. We don't use the weapons of our enemy to wage war. In his 2 Corinthians letter, Paul talks about for the weapons of our warfare. And he talks about the fact that we have powerful weapons for the tearing down of strongholds as we're able to convince people with the gospel of Christ. Folks, we don't need to use the tactics and the weapons of our enemy. We just need to press the attack with what God's given us to fight with. The sword of the Spirit. the shield of faith, the breastplate of righteousness, the helmet of salvation. We talked about this a little bit in our class Wednesday night, about the mob mentality of our world. And there are believers who believe the way to win this world to Jesus is through using the tactics of the world against the world. No. You know how we're going to win this world again? How we're going to change this world? You want to change the way people think? It won't be done through rallies and picket signs. It's going to be done across coffee tables. One person at a time. Because that's how it was done in the first place. That's the weapons of our warfare. But when we conquer the enemy, we're not going to take their horses and their chariots and use them against them. No. We hamstring the horses. We burn the chariots. And we keep fighting as soldiers of the cross. And then we look in verse 21, where it says, and at that time Joshua came and cut off the Anakim from the mountains, and from Hebron, and from Debir, and from Anab, and from the mountains of Judah, from the mountains of Israel. Joshua utterly destroyed them with their cities. Now what's intriguing about this is you don't probably register how significant this is. This Anakim here, these are, the Anakites are the last group that the Israelites conquered. That's significant. Because do you remember who the Anakites are? 1 Samuel chapter 17. We're going to look at that in a moment. But look at Numbers chapter 13:33. This is back when the spies brought back that report when they were first going into the promised land. And it's because of that unfaithfulness in that generation that the God's people had to wander for 40 years in the wilderness, and only 2 men of that entire first generation would make it in, Joshua and Caleb, because the rest had no faith. But listen to what it is that caused them to abandon and give up their faith. It says in Numbers 13:33, the spies said, "We saw the Nephilim there." The Nephilim are the descendants of Anak, the Anakites. These are the people that when they went and scouted the land, terrified them 40 years ago in the first place. They're the descendants of the Nephilim, the giants. And so all this time, they've been fighting everybody else. But they know eventually, guess who they're going to have to fight? The giants. The Anakites. Descendant from the Nephilim. And remember they said, to them, we seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes. And we looked the same to them. You see, Israel boldly faces their greatest fear. And that's when they finally have real victory. See, God's people still have areas in which we feel we cannot win. Some of you today are struggling with a temptation you've struggled with a long time. And sometimes you feel like you'll never win. That's your giant. That's your Anakites. Some of you are struggling with health concerns. Some of you are struggling with just things that are in your mind, depression or just worry or fear. And you've struggled with this giant so long, and you've sat and trembled in fear so long, it seems like you can't ever win. We need to take a lesson from the Israelites. That until they finally faced up to their giant, they never had real victory. And you notice Joshua, he's done with all the fear. He's done with the running. He goes and he hits them head on. He goes to their home and roots them out of their place. Proactively, aggressively. He attacks them head on. We can't ignore them, or they'll never be defeated. If Israel had just said, well, we've conquered everybody else. Let's just leave them in their hill country and let's just ignore them. Guess what? Then it's never defeated. It's never defeated. Yet, verse 22 is another lesson. It says, none of the Anakim were left in the land of the children of Israel, but they remained only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod. This is a failure on Joshua and the Israelites' part. There's a few of them left. And rather than going and sacking the cities of the Philistines and taking care of it right now, they do leave those cities that has some of the Anakim. And so here their great giant, because they didn't completely and totally root out their greatest enemy, what happens? These Anakim, these Nephilim, these giants, well, a few years later it'll be a problem again. Because from Gath, it says in 1 Samuel 17:4, a champion named Goliath, who was from Gath. 2 Samuel 21:19, in another battle with the Philistines at Gob, Elhanan, the son of Jair the Bethlehemite, killed the brother of Goliath. You see, Goliath and his brothers, most scholars believe, was a descendant of this group right here that fled and took refuge in the cities of the Philistines. And so they will face, because they didn't root out their greatest enemy, this giant in their life, completely and totally, they'll have to face it again and again and again. So the message is fairly clear. Joshua failed to fully defeat them. And we have to look our giants in the face and determine to beat them for good. Otherwise, if we ignore them, even if we relegate them to a distant, small portion, guess what? Those giants will rear their ugly head once again. You see, the truth is that we have an enemy and we all have giants. And even though we have all the tools we need to be victorious, like the Israelites had done in the past, we can be intimidated through fear and do nothing. We can let our giants remain and always feel like we'll never have the victory. Or we can be strong and courageous. We can take the fight to the enemy in our lives with the determination. You know, not all fights are quick, right? Not all fights are settled right away. It may be a long process. But what's important is beginning that battle. If it needs to begin for you today, beginning that battle and saying, from this day forward, this is my covenant. This is my decision. This is my absolute commitment. I'm going to win. And I'm not going to give up till I do. Strong and courageous. And when they finally beat those giants, and the land they had, peace. Tonight, as you look to your life, if you're struggling with giants, everybody has them. But if you feel like, and you probably, many of you are in the battle, good. Don't give up. Keep fighting. Keep fighting till you win completely. But if you feel like you're losing, and feel like maybe you'll never win, today may be the day that you need to decide to get serious about the war. If you need to come, if we can help you in any way, come right now as we stand and as we sing.